Welcome to the Bitcoin Masterclass module number 2, where we're going to look at the question of why was Bitcoin created? There was a very significant financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 that really led to a situation and an environment that was very much primed for the launch of something like Bitcoin. So we're going to get into what that looked like, why that happened, be building off our previous module asking, what is money? So what are we going to cover in this module? First, we're going to talk about the Great Financial Crisis, what happened, and most importantly, how did governments respond to the Great Financial Crisis? Because remember, at this point, ever since 1971, we are in a fiat regime where the monetary supply is controlled by the Federal Reserve. So with that kind of power, how did the governments respond to the Great Financial Crisis? We're going to talk about the genesis of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, and his Bitcoin whitepaper. Then we're going to specifically look at what did Bitcoin solve, or what was it trying to solve when it was invented. There are all these problems that the Great Financial Crisis really brought to the surface, and then those are the kind of problems that Bitcoin is trying to solve. Now, there will be possibly many new terms that you've not heard before introduced in this video, so don't worry. Anything that I say, any term you don't know, will be fleshed out further in a later video. So no worries there. Just keep on working through this course with us, and you're going to learn everything you need to learn. So the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. In 2008, the subprime mortgage bubble burst. Subprime mortgages were essentially risky mortgages that had a high likelihood of not being able to be repaid because of the financial status of those who received the mortgage. Banks were issuing these risky mortgages, and they were even bundling them and selling them to investors. So the risk that these subprime mortgages had were making their way through the entire financial system. And then on top of that, rating agencies improperly rated them, making them appear less risky than what they are, which means that investors were more likely to do risky things with them because they thought they were very secure investments. But really, they were piling risk on top of risk. And eventually that house of cards began to fall down. People who could not repay their loans would default on their mortgages, declare bankruptcy, and all of a sudden banks had all this bad debt on their balance sheet, and investors had bad investments that were sometimes valueless. And this turned into a contagion that just snowballed and spread through the financial system. The issues were so significant and systemic that the entire banking system faced insolvency. Very bad situation for everyone. Stock markets around the world crashed, leading to the worst depression since the Great Depression. So just that statement in of itself should give you an idea of how serious the situation was. Obviously, in such a serious situation, a government response is demanded. How did the government respond to the situation? Did they help all of the people that were going to be negatively affected by this massive downturn in the economy? In October 2008, the U.S. government passed TARP, a $700 billion bailout for banks. Remember, the banks are the ones who caused this problem in the first place. Now, are banks and the financial system an important thing to make sure you keep afloat and keep going? Yes, to a point, an argument there. But remember, banks were the ones who caused this problem in the first place. These banks were responsible for the problems that led to the Great Financial Crisis. Most of the funds from this bailout were injected directly into the banks through equity purchases. So it did end up being essentially, here's money, please continue operating as a bank even though you would otherwise be insolvent except for this money from the government. Bank executives still received very large bonuses, millions of dollars, essentially funded by these bailouts. Now you can imagine how bad the optics were with things like that. You have these banks that are responsible for this great financial crisis, and the top leaders of these banks are receiving these multi-million-dollar bonuses essentially paid for by government money that they received because of what a bad job they did, and how you see how there's no accountability being shown through all this, and even worse. Little to no punishment was handed out to those responsible, ultimately. And no similar direct relief was given to struggling homeowners who were stuck in bad loans. When the stock market crashed and the depression happened, home values plummeted, so a lot of people were underwater on their home mortgages and had to default or had to foreclose, had to declare bankruptcy. Federal Reserve cut interest rates and launched liquidity programs to stimulate the financial system. They also started quantitative easing, where they purchased trillions of dollars of government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from banks. So again, they're buying things from the bank. They're putting money onto the bank balance sheet by buying things from the bank. Purchasing these mortgage-backed securities cleaned up the bank's balance sheet, so it took a lot of bad debt off the bank's balance sheets. Purchasing government bonds from them inflated asset prices and the stock market. Remember what we talked about in our last module. When you do things like inflate the currency through printing money and buying government bonds from the banks, you are injecting more money into the economy, which drives up asset prices, which benefits those who already own a lot of assets and hurts those who are trying to acquire assets, who are more on the poor end of the spectrum. There's no way that printing this amount of money and injecting it into the economy was not going to have that effect. Interest rates cuts didn't help anyone who was already locked into a mortgage, right? So if you're already suffering in a bad mortgage situation, now the banks have easier access to credit through low interest rate loans. New home buyers may have access to a lower interest rate now, but it doesn't help anyone currently suffering. While receiving this government assistance, almost no top bank executives faced criminal charges, and banks generally paid fines for their misconduct. So you end up in this divide of how Wall Street was being treated versus how Main Street was being treated by the government and the Federal Reserve through this process. You have bailouts, where banks were essentially given money to stay afloat. Citizens were not given the same benefit if they were on the verge of bankruptcy, foreclosure, anything like that. Liquidity programs that the Fed provided gave loans and purchased debt from banks and companies. These benefits were to consumers only downstream. There was nothing directly beneficial to consumers. Interest rates were lowered. Banks and new borrowers benefited, but not people suffering under a current bad loan that they were given by the bank, or suffering under the fact that their house price had collapsed, or their home value had collapsed. Quantitative easing inflated asset prices, which benefited large investors and banks, but generally not the average person. So, in general, you had a situation where all of these government benefits were going to the ones who had caused the problem, not to the average person suffering in the situation. So you can see, if you're able to step back and look at what was going on at the time, you can see how horrible it made the whole system look. Corrupt as all get out. You have those suffering under the problem caused, those that caused the problem, and the government is doing everything they can to help and prop up the ones who caused the problem while providing no accountability, no jail time, nothing like that. And the people who are on the ground, just normal people on Main Street, just continuing to suffer under the situation for years. This is what led to a lot of the Occupy Wall Street stuff. Without getting too deeply into that, you can see why there would be so much angst and frustration and feeling of injustice about the whole situation. You have to remember, money printing is a tax. So in this case, when the government's giving all that help to the banks, that's not just money the government has. They've invisibly taxed those suffering from the banks to give to the banks. Okay, all that money from the government was printed money. It devalued all the money that people had in their savings. Okay, so this money was It was a wealth transfer. It transferred money from the American people to the banking system in order to prop up the banking system, all without them having a say in the matter. And this is only possible when you're under a fiat money system controlled by a central bank. So the great financial crisis kind of exposed what can happen in a fiat money central bank system in all its ugliness for people to see if they were paying attention to it. So with that, welcome to the origin of Bitcoin. October 31st, 2008 was the launch of the Bitcoin whitepaper written by Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know if that was a male, female, or a group of people. And the fact that he, she, they remain pseudonymous to this date is a very cool part of the Bitcoin origin story. It was titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And that is exactly what it was all about. The paper laid out exactly what the subtitle says, with all the complex cryptography and networking included. So you can imagine the challenges of trying to do that, of trying to recreate basically my ability to hand $5 to a friend of mine digitally with no banks or no intermediaries being involved. The white paper built on and bundled previous technologies and ideas to execute this one idea. So you've got previous cryptography concepts, lots of things have been built on by the cypherpunks, all this stuff that built up to Bitcoin being developed. And its completeness suggests it may have already been under development for some time. It's a little challenging for me personally to believe the great financial crisis happens and someone just all of a sudden decides to put this grand idea together in the midst of that. It was probably something that they'd been thinking on, working on for some time. So what was Bitcoin trying to solve? You've got this great financial crisis blow up that's happening. What is being revealed? What is being shown? What are the problems coming to light that Bitcoin is trying to solve now? The first thing is trying to solve the trust assumptions in the current banking system and monetary system. Remember, when you have fiat system, the citizens are completely trusting that the central bank is not going to abuse the power that they've been given. But during the great financial crisis, it was greatly abused. The people were taxed to bail out the banks. It was a wealth transfer again. And unfortunately, when you are in a system like that and the government controls things, which essentially they do with the Fed, or through the Fed, the central bank has a monopoly on that situation. You can't release a competing money. Remember our quote from Module 1, where the economist Hayek said, we can't take the money out of the government hands. All we could do would be to introduce something slowly and on the sly and at the grassroots level to try and replace it. That is what Bitcoin is trying to do. In the very first Bitcoin block, there's this quote, "The Times 03 Jan 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." On that date, that was a headline from the London Times saying that they're on the brink of giving another bailout to the banks because of the great financial crisis. From the very beginning, Satoshi was telling us, this is why I invented. This is why this is here. Because of what they are doing to us through the fiat central banking system. More things that Bitcoin had to try and solve. If money must be electronic, how do you create digital scarcity? If nothing electronic is scarce, no file, no picture, no song, anything can be copied over and over again electronically. How do you create something digital that's also scarce? That's an interesting question, hadn't been done before. But remember, if you want to have a good money, one of the qualities is it has to be scarce. So it's an unavoidable thing that had to be solved. How do you prevent double spending? If you're going to have electronic money, even if you can make it scarce, how do you prove that someone hasn't bought multiple things with that same scarce asset? How do you do that? We're going down the logical train of, well, if we can do this, becomes a problem. There's lots of questions that Bitcoin had to try and solve if it was going to work effectively. How do you recreate the ability to hand someone money digitally. You're removing all the trust assumptions. How do you do that? It's just, I could envelop and put a bow on all these problems by saying that. How in the world do we recreate digitally being able to hand someone money with no third parties involved to make that transaction happen? And then let's just say that we're able to do this, that we're able to invent this system that works, it functions. How do we prevent this system from being censored or captured by state actors? Because remember, we had commodity money, right? We had gold, we had silver, we had sound hard money already. That didn't prevent us from going down the path of that eventually being captured by central banking. They control the commodity money, and now we're beholden to a fiat system. If we invent this thing, if we invent Bitcoin, how do we prevent it from us just going down that same path over the next 100 years of, yeah, we had Bitcoin for a while, but then it got captured by the state, and now we're back to the fiat system again that we're living under. How do we prevent that from happening? Here's the big idea I want you guys to remember. Bitcoin works through the invention of the decentralized blockchain network. Now, here's where you realize, or I can explain, that Bitcoin is the door into all of the crypto space, because it's this invention of the blockchain network that is going to spur on all future crypto inventions. Okay, this decentralized blockchain network concept was invented in order to create Bitcoin and create this sound digital money. But then once it was created, people started asking the question, what else could I do with this? So that's how the invention of Bitcoin really became the invention of the whole crypto space, is because this decentralized blockchain network is the new invention. It's the new thing that's now on the scene that people are now going to try and figure out everything that can be done with it. And that is crypto. Once you understand Bitcoin and understand blockchain networks, that is why you are so much better equipped to then move forward into understanding the rest of the crypto space. So, how do decentralized blockchain networks work? That is module 3. So, I hope that this module has given you a big taste of how ugly things can get under a centralized fiat regime, just like we saw in the Great Financial Crisis, and why it would be such a good idea to have a better money that's not controlled by the state, that's decentralized, that can be used by ordinary people without fear of it being inflated away and controlled at the whims of the government. Okay, Bitcoin came out of that situation because the Great Financial Crisis created this environment where people were acutely aware of the problems caused by being stuck in the US dollar fiat system. And that's very important to understand as to why Bitcoin as an invention is so significant. If you don't understand how bad things can get when the government wants to take your money, wants to tax you, and they have the power to do it, then you won't understand how important Bitcoin is. And if you are in a country that's under hyperinflation or has had your assets seized by the government because they're going insolvent, you understand probably even better than us Americans do the significance of having something like this. So that's why we wanted to spend so much time on what is money and talking about an example of how bad things get once you're under that fiat central bank controlled regime. So I hope that this has been very helpful. If it has been, please like and subscribe to this video and this channel so that other people can find it. If you have any questions or things you want to add to what I've said, please comment below. I would love to respond and engage with you on some of these topics. I love discussing them. That's why I'm here. That's why I've made these videos. And I hope that you will continue to move through these modules with us as we continue to build up our knowledge and understanding of the significance and importance of Bitcoin. I will see you in module 3.